Is it on the web?
Yeah, the web.
Like
Scammed in.
That's right. Virtual Jason. Avatar Jason. Oh.
Well, there's just one my thumb again.
Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for coming to celebrate with us Indigenous Peoples Day. I want to thank each person present today. This is truly a gift. In many ways, I just invite you to open your heart and your minds for what you're going to receive today. It is a blessing in many ways. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. I want to thank our president, our board of trustees, our staff, our faculty, and the students to be educated on We Have Land as a gift. And we want to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'll bring Jane over to read the acknowledgement, and then I'll get into talking about our presenter.
Hi, I'm Jane. So we acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered today is unceded territory of the Wiyot people who continue to live and thrive on this land today. It is surrounded by the traditional, ancestral, and present homeland of several indigenous nations, including the Hupa, Karuk, the Toli, Tolowa, Wailaki, and Yurok that make up Humboldt County.
Thank you. And we don't just want to do a land acknowledgement. We want to move beyond words into action and ensure that both our students, faculty, staff, and our community know that our Indigenous peoples are not only valued, welcome, but honored, respected, and loved. And so I'm going to read the formal overview of my presenter today, and then my note card informal. Brace yourself, friend.
Oh, goodness.
Vincent has lived in Humboldt County for the last 26 years. Before that, he was born and raised in Bakersfield, California. Vincent has a graduate degree in social work from CSU Long Beach and a bachelor's degree in psychology from Humboldt State University. Vincent has been a part-time lecturer for HSU Social Work Department since 2010, having taught over 20 courses. He also was a lecturer here at College of the Redwoods. Since 1998, his career journey has offered opportunities to work as a therapist, counselor at United Indian Health Services, Humboldt State's Counseling and Psych Services, and the Dean of the Student's Office. Currently, Vincent is a program coordinator for the Northern California Indian Council, the Luke Tribal Youth Program. On to the handy dandy note card. Vincent is my friend. He has been my friend, and I can call him for consultations if I'm trying to figure something out with a student. I can call him for suggestions on Wu-Tang Clan or anything related to music. His care for the community and our colleagues is outstanding. There are people in this life that say they care, but there are people in this life that you can call 24 hours a day and say, I need help, and he'd be right there. Because of him, we had access to our previous speaker, Chegg. If I hadn't gone to his house for a barbecue, I wouldn't have known Chegg, and many other colleagues in the community I've met just eating at Vince's house. I have had the pleasure of knowing both his father and his mother. His mother was a nurse. She was a healer. She was a comforter. And she was kindness personified. His father was an advocate and lawyer and is a warrior. He's compassionate and honorable and strong. Many people don't know this, but I love elders. I have been dubbed the elder whisperer. So it always ends up that no matter where we go, I end up hanging with the elders. And I have had the privilege of hanging with his father at almost every event. And he is most humble and kind and gentle. But I see in Vince a combination of both of those gifts. I see a combination of those gifts, and it's a life well lived and continuously given. What you receive today will be a treasured gift. You will receive the gifts of generational knowledge, of healing, of sacrifice and love. What is he has received wholeheartedly from previous generations, he gives to the next generation. And without further ado, here's my friend Vincent.
Thank you, Leah. She kind of came at me from a different angle, thinking about my parents, which is good. I think for everyone here and for everyone out in the audience, we think about our generations that come before us, whoever we consider our family. It could be our aunties and our uncles, our grandparents, our cousins, siblings who raised us. People who are not blood relatives, but they pretty much can be because they took the time to nurture us and be our mentors. So I think there's all kinds of facets of what family is. My father is still alive. He's my tribal background. I'm a Chumash descendant from the Santa Barbara area. That's where my father's family comes from, Ventura, Santa Barbara. My father's 89 years old, and I honor him today with this work. Right off the bat, he spent many, many years. And the other thing I want to add is both my mom was a full-time nurse for 45 years. She's passed on now, been gone for about 11 years. My father is still alive, 89 years old. He ended up getting his Juris Doctorate at the time when there was no scholarships for minority students at the time. We're talking 1949, 50s. So one of the first California Indians to attend a school. He actually went to the University of San Francisco with Bill Russell and Casey Jones, part of that basketball team of the Dons that was dominant as the basketball players become NBA legends and coaches in the NBA for the Boston Celtics. My dad actually was friends with Bill Russell and Casey Jones, kind of a handful of minorities that attended USF at the time. But he was just a Chumash kid, born and raised in a kind of a ranching / farming community family that would kind of they would homestead in different ranch lands. They never owned anything, but he himself got his Juris Doctorate, which was quite a victory. But now he could see me now as a son talking at universities and colleges here with all of you and kind of even having this. I want to laugh and cry at the same time because he spent a lot of times going to my schools to talk to my principals and assistant principals as I was being suspended several times. Almost expelled in high school my freshman year. So things have kind of turned around. I say that it's a very personal reflection because we're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, and it's a time to celebrate. And we'll get more into that, but just want to acknowledge that because just like for myself, but all of you here presently, and I'm getting to know some of the students here and folks I'm meeting, the resiliency that you have, just keep holding on to that. You utilize your resources, ask for help. It's tough to do that sometimes, especially for some of us who are ultra independent, because we've had to be. But there are some loving people out there in the world. One thing I'll add too is, and yeah, Aaliyah threw me for a loop on that intro, I'm telling you. But it's beautiful, I appreciate it. But I want to acknowledge my family, my wife and my two children, my daughter Pectasan, my son Pachomio, my wife Elsie, who feed me and nurture me every day in many kind of different ways. But one thing I was going to add, going back to my family background, is I'm the youngest of 10 children, by the way. So both my parents, same parents staying together. My mom was a full-time nurse at the same time, raising 10 children. And a lot of times she was the breadwinner in the family. So she was always consistently working. So I want to honor her in that way, what she endured to keep us going. And most of the time with a smile on her face, and most of the time keeping her head up. My dad being 89 years old, some of you have grandparents that age or aunties or uncles. Those are people who survived the Great Depression and surviving the Great Depression and World War II and all those things. Also, being a minority at that time, I think of my father, what he went through. He was raised by a single mother in Bakersfield. So, but Indigenous Peoples Day, as we talk about this, is about resiliency. It's about who we are now, where we're going, and how we're moving forward. So I'm going to share with you some concepts today. Before we get started, I want to get myself centered and kind of helping myself kind of be centered and being here, give myself a sense of grounding. And for all of you as well, I want to share a song. It's a Chumash song. There's a story, the song. Well, I'll sing the song first and I'll share the story afterwards. And please stay with me, everybody. If I happen to not start sharing a story, remind me to share the story after I sing the song. Okay? Sometimes I might go off on other concepts. I'm going to share a song to kind of get us grounded, welcoming us to this day. It's a beautiful day of the sun that's here. And We have the air that we breathe, food on the table, a place to stay. We're secure. We have loved ones in our lives. We want to say thank you, but at the same time, celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. This is a song that's not from this area. This is a Chumash song. It comes from the islands of the Channel Islands, San Nicolas Island specifically, and it was sang. And we use clapsticks is what we sing with. This is elderberry that we sing with where I come from. So the story behind that song is, some of you may remember 3rd or 4th grade, you read The Island of the Blue Dolphins. That's actually based on a true story of a woman that was named by the Spanish in California, the Santa Barbara area, named Juana Marie, but she had an Indian name. We didn't necessarily know that name, but she actually have a memorial where she was buried at the Santa Barbara mission. That song was saying she's longing for her people. She sang that to them. The language and dialect that she had, she was Chumash. The dialect was not known at that time specifically, but from San Nicolas Island. So that's actually based on a story where she was the fur trappers, and through killings and through colonization that was occurring. The islands were one of the first places that people came to before coming to the mainland of Santa Barbara. But that song I sing to think of her and her endurance to keep knowing who we are. She was lonely for her people when she sang for that song. Also the endurance of who we are and how I stand here today with my own children and soon to be, down the road, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So I share that song with you. It's a song that's sang there. So welcome to all of you. Also, I think they gave me a clicker that worked, which is pretty cool. It's cool. All right. So I want to share as we're starting out here, and Aaliyah I'm very flattered to be asked and honored to be asked to be a part of this conversation about Indigenous Peoples Day. So just happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Because I just want to maybe give you a little bit of historical context. We need to give love and thoughts to the Taino people, the Caribbean. Let's think about them today. The Caribbean, and in some ways, even more specifically, Puerto Rico, that as we call it now. These are the indigenous people of those islands of the Caribbean. That's where Columbus got lost and ran into on accident. He did not mean to go there. Just so we know, as Columbus, the former holiday as it was known as, just get to the true historical context of it all. He got lost in the Caribbean. And to the Taino people, he landed there and disrupted a way of life. And what we know from history, what's taught us with research and studies, subsequently later on, Columbus came back for other voyages afterwards and took Taino people as slaves, took them back to Europe. Besides the diseases they were exposed to, which killed off a lot of Taino people, that was a big problem there with Columbus. So we think about the true history of Columbus Day, that's what we're talking about. So now we celebrate the endurance and the resilience of Taino people who are still alive today. So I want to acknowledge that, but also not only for the Taino people, but for the 500 plus tribal nations, sovereign tribal nations, and descendants of those nations who are still alive today in 2021. So that's what we say. So when you think of Indigenous Peoples Day, it's not just some I don't know what some might say in some circles. It's not just a cancel culture term that's being used and thrown around from a progressive agenda. It's actually American history that needs to be taught and understood. Indigenous Peoples Days, because this is all Indigenous. I have WEOP brothers and sisters in this room right now. This is where villages once stood. This is areas of gathering here on the Eureka campus is WEOP land as we look at it. We're close to the Mattole people, Lost Coast Petrolia. We go up north, we got Yurok, Tolowa, we got Hoopas to the east. All kinds of folks that we have around in our area, the Karuks on the areas too that we all aware of in our local North Coast area. And we're gonna get to some of that. So before I move on, I just wanna talk about that. I wanna look at some concepts. I don't know if you can see it up here or not, but there's one thing I wanna get out of our vocabulary right now for all of you here presently, but also people that are out there. Words like discovery, that needs to stop. That needs to stop. If people are already there and living for tens and thousands of years before you arrived, you did not discover it. It was already been existing. Time immemorial is not a word that's used by tribal indigenous peoples just for the heck of it. It means that we have ties to the land that goes back 10,000, 20,000, 25,000 years. And to some people's ears, sometimes that's difficult to hear because we know we have a parts of the community in our society that's out there that seems to believe human existence we've only been around as humans for 2,021 years. That's not accurate. Because indigenous peoples have been practicing religions and songs and speaking their language, government systems, environmental engineering concepts, traditional ecological knowledge, transportation, all kinds of city structures, what we now call society structures, tens of thousands of years ago. Same thing for the concept of founded. You can't be found if you were already there. I don't need you to tell me I'm found. So when we're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, we are actually kind of in protest, but also just speaking the truth of, we no longer use the word discovered or founded, because people were already here, living in existence. Settled, I don't know what settled means. We're going to take away your spirituality. Some might say the boarding schools, which we might be all aware of in our recent news in the last month, and particularly in Canada. Just know that we have boarding schools all over California, by the way. When we say settled, what does that mean? We're settling people away from their spirituality they've had for tens of thousands of years to be more of a different religion that does not belong to them, does not fit with them. Is that what settled means? So if that's the case, let's stop using the word settled. Also, even civilized. What does that even mean to be civilized? There's some research and studies that talk about even the use of the tomahawk, if you will, as a weapon from back east. I'm a California Indian from Chumash. I'm a descendant. Tomahawk that actually was first used by the Spanish as a weapon, but then it's become synonymous and connected with Native American people with tomahawks. So the level of ignorance that gets spread around. The idea of scalping was first used by non-Indian people to help proof of death. Not very fun to talk about, I know. But I just want to talk, when we're talking about Indigenous Peoples Day and why we're moving away from Columbus Day, is we have to talk about the facts that we're talking about here, historically looking at things from that context. Also, we see the land bridge theory. We're going to watch a video here momentarily that you're all going to take a look at. The video that was put together by Cal State Long Beach students, along with myself, with the help of United Indian Health Services, Humboldt County Department of Health and Human Services, Two Feathers Native American Family Services, Juvenile Justice Commission that we use to train social workers and other providers. That's going to talk about those concepts. But the land bridge, Vikings, we're talking about people that said, yeah, there's other people who've been here in Humboldt County before, have been in the United States and landed here. But also there again, the Bering Strait theory does not ring true, because even the Channel Islands off Ventura, the story I shared with the woman on San Lucas Island, they've actually carbon dated human remains that have been found there that are over 20,000 years old. That says that people, if you think about that, let's go back 20,000 years ago, people were living in existence. I want to read a poem to you before I move on. Before I move on to our film clip. And this is a poem that perhaps people in our audience with your own family ties, the sense of connection of who you are. I think of my father, born in 1932, his mother, tribal woman herself, also has ties to Fort Tejon. My grandfather has ties to Santa Barbara, also San Luis Obispo. This is a poem by a professor, lecturer, I think she's retired now, by Georgiana Valois Sanchez, who's Chumash in Long Beach, who taught there for many years in their literary department and kind of English as well. But I like this poem. It says a lot to me, but this also kind of gives a universally for a lot of tribal nations and what we struggle with identity and who we are, and letting people know that we are still here. We're alive, we're not going anywhere. So I share this poem with you. Chumash, he says, and when he says it, I think of ancient sea lion hunts and salt spray windswept across my face. They tell him his people are dead, terminated. It's official, US rubber stamped official, Chumash, terminated. A people who died, they say, a case for anthropologists. Ah, but this old one whose face is ancient prayers come to rest, this old one knows who he is. Chumash, he says. And somewhere sea lions still gather along the California coast, and salt spray rises, rainbow mist above the constant breaking of the waves. Chumash, he says. Indigenous, we say. Native American, we say. Even the concept of indigenous is something that people are still trying to grapple with right now. So I want to share that poem with you I like that. Once again, it's a poem, but I want to give full credit. It's Georgiana Valois Sanchez, a Chumash poet. So I want to share that with you. And right now we're going to shift gears. I'm going to show a video for all of you to talk more about Humboldt County in our region specifically. The quick little video clip of our North Coast region here in Humboldt County. Oh, and actually, do I still have audio? Yeah. And actually, while you're watching this, folks, if you would, I'm going to open it up for some questions and reactions. If folks want to have some questions to our audience that's out there, if you want to type in something in the chat or on the microphone, and our audience that's here, feel free to ask me a question afterwards. I'm curious about your thoughts on watching this. Any things that come to mind. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I think this just needs to be turned up.
We have some audio issues we're working on right now. Thank you, everybody, for your patience.
People. The elders say that people have always lived here. Indigenous people have lived in this area since the beginning of time. Each culture has followed a way of life carefully designed to respect nature and preserve the balance between the ocean, the rivers, the trees, the animals, the birds, and other people. The elders say that people have always lived here. They did not travel from somewhere else. The oral histories of our local indigenous nations contain no reference to the unproven land bridge theory that says we migrated from Asia. Before Humboldt County and the state of California existed, several indigenous nations lived in mutually acceptable geographic locations. The Yurok people lived along the coast, from Trinidad up to the village of Requa, where the river empties into the ocean, to the village of Witchpeck, located right before the confluence of the Klamath and Trinity rivers. The Humboldt people lived from near the mouth of the Trinity River to above the mouth of the South Fork of the Trinity. The Karuk people are located along the Klamath River from Bluff Creek to Happy Camp and beyond. The Wiyot people live along the lower reaches of the Eel River and along the Mad River, as well as throughout the Humboldt Bay and inland to Blue Lake. Keep in mind These are broadly defined terms that identify groups of people. The Cholula or Redwood Creek have their own identity, and many people belong to this culture. In the South, you will find the Mattole people by the Eel and Mattole River regions. Due to the intermarriage between cultures, some tribal names aren't as common. Some tribes were practically destroyed by settlers, and some were forced to relocate. This area is unique because each culture was a village-based society with their own language and customs. There are still many Native people today who live in these places where their ancestral villages once stood, and they can proudly tell you the names of their home village. The current locations of reservations and rancherias are set on only a small part of the indigenous areas of the Native people. Today in Humboldt County, there are federally recognized tribes residing on several reservations and rancherias, and there are non-federally recognized tribes that are comprised of members of cultural groups working to gain or regain their federal tribal recognition. A federally recognized tribe has inherent rights and powers of self-government and is entitled to specific benefits and services under various federal laws. They are recognized as a unique political entity that has a formal relationship with the United States government. The Yurok tribe, the Hupa tribe, Table Bluff Reservation, Wiyot tribe, and the Karuk tribe are each federally recognized and are headquartered on a reservation. Rancherias belong on federal trust land for the use and possession of a Native tribe or a group of Native people. The Blue Lake Rancheria, Big Lagoon Rancheria, Trinidad Rancheria, and Ronerville Rancheria all have the same status as tribes, but are comprised of culturally different Native people. Reservations and rancherias are based on federal trust land. A majority of members from tribes in this area live off reservation and off their rancheria among the general public. Non-federally recognized tribes are a group of Native people belonging to a specific culture with no political rights recognized by the United States government. The indigenous religions of the area are diverse and not easily explained. Several ceremonies continue to be held by the people. One such ceremony is the brush dance, where members of the Yurok, Hupa, and Karuk cultures all participate together. The ceremony is held to pray for a sick child, and members of each group dress in sacred regalia in order to help send their prayers. During the ceremony, songs are offered by members of every group, and each piece of regalia and each basket used is considered to be a living member of society with a spirit. Other ceremonies, such as the white deerskin dance and the jump dance, have specific spiritual meanings that have been passed on for thousands of years. Each member of society, from an elder to a baby, has certain roles and certain rules to follow within these ceremonies. These roles and responsibilities are also meant to be followed in tribal communities and societies in general.
There's a scene in there as we're returning back. Max, right?
Yeah.
Yes, got his name right. Max, Max Hoppin here. The student staff here at College of the Redwoods want to thank them for all their work, making their mornings even more interesting for them. But he's clicking back and forth between the PowerPoint and the video, so I appreciate Max for that. There's a scene in there where you see the folks can recall, even here in person too, you can recall the scene where there's a young boy and he has glasses on. You see the girl in the back on her regalia, she has glasses on. These are people I consider close friends that's actually Chake Lowry, who was here. That's his younger brother and younger sister in that picture. This Chake helped produce this with our help, with students from Long Beach and stuff. But some of you are familiar with the recent thing that happened with the Sumeg State Park that's being renamed up above Trinidad, where the demonstration village is for the Yuroks, and actually it's a ceremonial site where they actually have ceremonies. The head ranger, one of the rangers interpreters, that's he was on the Los Angeles Times over the weekend, quoted and interviewed. That's him. The guy with the glasses is a young man, as a 14-year-old, if you can believe that. Skip was now he drank some Gatorade or something with some protein shakes. He's super tall, but doesn't have glasses now. But that's Skip. And the young girl that's in that picture, she now has her LCSW as a master's, and she's the Bear River Social Service Director for Bear River Tribe. So it talks about the resilience of our people, how we keep going and doing this work, and the role of being traditional ceremonial people at the same time living in a Western world, doing the work we can to help our people. So I just found that was a very interesting situation that we just saw there. We were looking at there. So are there any thoughts from what people just saw there? Even comments like, wow, I've never knew that before, or we living in Humboldt County and Delaware County particularly also as well. This film does focus a lot on Humboldt County, but anybody, any questions from the audience, anything in the chat or comments or reflections? I'm open to kind of have a time for if folks have anything to add or want to offer comment here. Any questions or thoughts or reactions? Yes, sir.
So I have friends that are from different tribes. You mentioned Bear River. I worked there for a long time, and I got a lot of friends over there. But the Karuk and the Yurok, two of my best friends are from that tribe. But I heard that are they related? Are the Karuk and the Yurok related, or are they?
Well, I will. So I'm gonna give you my Vincent Feliz Chumash descendant, born and raised in Bakersfield. I've been married into a Yurok and Karuk family for 22 years now, probably longer. My wife's not gonna appreciate that. I don't know the numbers correctly, but it's a long time. We have a number of people, and I think we have some local people in the room here. There's a lot of local people who are probably all three tribes. Yeah, exactly. We have a student here who is. So you could be Yurok, Karuk, and Wiyot, or Wiyot and Taloa. I have someone who's Wiyot and Yurok. So because the intermarriage is happening, so it happened. You might even have someone, because of the boarding schools, interesting, you'll have people who are Lakota and Yurok, because family members, people, the parents met up at a boarding school, in 1920. You never know. Or Navajo or Dene, if you will. So, intermarriages happen. It happens.
I guess what I was getting at.
Yeah,
was,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Sure, it's
I
okay.
think what I was getting at was, were they one tribe at one point, or did they split up? Or?
I can't answer. I don't have that answer, so I'll claim ignorance on that. I know that there's what I can say, and I don't want to overstep my bounds. I give credit to all my cultural mentors that are here. There's dance leaders and ceremonial people who know the answers, who have probably a better perspective, particularly our elders, but even our folks who are middle-aged now, who have been around with dances a lot, who are a lot more savvy to those things. But I don't want to misspeak, but you will notice sometimes that some of the tribes have just little varying differences in cultures. The way to do ceremonies is a little bit different than the other ones. So perhaps that's differences. I'll speak from my level. The Yalamne Yokuts of Bakersfield intermingled with the Chumash that came from the west into the interior of what we now know as the Central Valley and the Grapevine. But they're two separate tribes. So there's just different tribal entities that are there. Maybe even where some of the Pomo borders with the Maidu, but still Pomo and Maidu. So I don't know the answer to that, but I would just ask questions. So it's a good question you're asking me. And that's the same for everybody here in the audience, maybe as a lesson in general. And you're not doing that. I won't be bringing this as a lesson for everybody, but I'm not saying you're doing this at all. We never make assumptions. Ask questions. The best way to be, I guess, what's the term now? Woke? I just call it activism. I don't think it's wokeness. I think it's wanting to find the truth. I love how they're naming everything now. I love it. But anyway, ask questions. Talk to the right people. Do it in a good way. If you see an elder, don't come at them with your what look like Johnny Reporter with your big clip of your notepad. Like, okay, here we go. Next question. No, don't do that. Buy a cup of coffee, chill out a little bit, get to know them a little bit, just like you do with anybody in your family. And if they want to talk to you, but ask questions. Also, ask questions that treat people as you want to be treated, right? The golden rule, right? So you're not going to, especially if we're talking about tribal religions and spirituality, we don't go up to a Mormon and ask them to talk about their religion immediately, right? Those are kind of some deep stuff or political beliefs. We have to do that. But I think asking questions and engaging in communication is the best way to kind of help us grow as a people in general, particularly the United States with tribes. But good question. I didn't really have an answer for you, but I hope that helps clear the concept.
I don't have a specific answer, but my tribe down in Arizona, Fort Mojave. So there's Fort Mojave and then there's Mojave, but they spell it differently. And then there's also Quetzalcoatl down in Yuma, Arizona.
Oh.
At one point in time, we were all one people before kind of colonization happened, and they started putting us on different reservations and spreading us out down along the Colorado River. So I don't know if that would be the same for here either, if they were all one at one point, but even now to this day, there are different like dialects in the language. Because my dad can speak like, or he can understand Mojave, but he's fluent in Quetzal, but there's a little bit of differences of like how the words are dragged out, or you know, certain stuff. So that's just like my history of like that. Yeah.
So what we may have noticed here with our colleagues here, we've had a question that just occurred, and a response by one of our colleagues kind of taking a healthy risk to share with us. Yeah, remember what I said in the discussion about, you know, just like the Taino people and the resilience of our people, we're 500 plus indigenous nations thriving. So there's going to be some interesting stories that are all over the place. I think of Fort Mojave because that's on the other side of the Tehachapi Mountains.
Yeah.
Going towards that's from Bakersfield. So I think of that. I know Mojave. You know, and you know, there's connections there. My dad has had with people for several years. My dad used to run a tribal health clinic down there. But I think of that. But yeah, the language stuff. The Chumash, for instance, where I come from San Luis Obispo all the way to Malibu, inland to Kern County, there's 7 different dialects of the Chumash language, just in its own Chumash tribe. A lot of the Chumash are using Inaseño, which is San Ynez Reservation area, or Babareño. I speak Babareño, that's how I've been taught a little bit. I'm not a fluent speaker, nor am I a linguist, nor am I going to pretend to be one. I know some words, but what I'm saying is you learn that language is, even within tribes, is diversity, right? We talk about the word diversity. Once again, we're not making assumptions, so you ask about it. Even within a Yurok tribe, say up here, Yurok tribe, you might have a family where one part of the family is very traditional, goes to brush dances, works on regalia, speaks the language, and one part of the family, they're still Yurok of who they are, same blood relative, same family. They're just not part of that. They don't do that. It's not part of their life. Still Yurok. So the diversity of that, right? Say the same thing we can say for a Hmong family. There's differences of how people live their lives. That's the diversity of tribes. Some are on that journey of acculturation. Like, where are they at? Do they, you know, has their spirit awoken in terms of their indigenous belief system? Maybe. Or you might have people who are just as much Yurok who might be perhaps practicing Christian religion. I don't know. But I know I've been around long enough to where I can't make assumptions like that. Where assuming that, oh, that's what it means to be Native American. Because also part of this celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day is the role of talking about identity. What the heck does that even mean for us as tribal people now in 2021? So good questions. I appreciate that. Awesome. Other thoughts or anything on the chat that's out there? Questions? Okay. Well, we'll move on, but thank you for jumping in there with the questions. So where I was going with this when I was talking earlier was kind of where we stand now. Looking at the history, where we're at now in 2021, what are we doing? We're looking at different things. I know right now in the media, the boarding schools, the Canadian boarding schools, and the actual land that was found and bodies being found. We have boarding schools all over California, by the way, from Sherman. People born and raised know where Riverside is at. Riverside, California, big city. The Sherman Indian boarding school is down there. Hoopa had a boarding school where it's very close to where the Hoopa High School is located now. Up in Klamath, there was a boarding school near where the Margaret Keating School is at. We have Greenville, California, the one that, you know, the town, I think that was unfortunately burnt down in the wildfire. That's a notorious boarding school that was there in Greenville, California. People, that's a history that we may not be aware of, but just know that California, boarding schools wasn't just something where we kind of think in our mind that only happened over in Lakota territory or Montana or South Dakota. California had a whole bunch of boarding schools happening, Arizona as well, all over the place. So just some maps, some visual stuff for all of you to take a look at here. I like this map because I'm being born and raised in Bakersfield. And I always think of my LA friends here from Los Angeles. If you look at that, this is Indigenous California. And I'm here to say, whether or not you believe it or not, there are still descendants and tribal people still connected to every single one of these tribes in California still living today. They may be intermarried with Chicano families from Mexico. They may be intermarried with Vietnamese, Hmong families, Filipino families, but there are still tribal descendants that are tied to every single one of these tribes as we know it. Also, when you look at this map, I just want to give you a bit of a heads up too. These are very broad anthropological terms. So the Yokuts do not call themselves Yokuts. They're Wachumni. They're Yalamne is what they call themselves in the Southern Valley. So if we look at the top there, northern, what they're saying on this map, Northern Valley Yokuts, that's Stockton. That's Stockton. You have a little bit of a 2021 little map thing. All the way down Southern Valley Yokuts, that's Bakersfield. That's the Grapevine. Chumash territory, you got Catalamuc. That's what we call, what is it, Santa Clara? We used to call it back in the day Valencia, where Magic Mountain's at. That's like Catawba territory. Tataviam, Gabrieno, all these areas. Also known as Tongva as well. There's some Tongva tribes there. I do want to say something today. I was talking to Chegg earlier, and as a tribal indigenous person and descendant, especially as a California Indian, some of you, show of hands here, have you heard about what happened at Manhattan Beach about a month ago? The land that was ceded to an African-American family that actually were deed holders at one point, it was taken. And so as a progressive, if you will, BIPOC social justice move, the land was given back to the African-American families. As a California indigenous person, I'm a little perplexed by that. Because the land belongs to the Tongva, Gabrielino people, regardless of what the deed says. Somehow in there, colonization took place to how that land was deeded in the first place to non-Indian people. So I'm going to say that. That might be controversial. So social justice only went so far there. Social justice needs to recognize that Los Angeles County Basin and the coastline, Malibu, which we call Maliwu. Malibu is a Chumash word, comes from that, actually means Maliwu, having to do with the strong winds of that area. Also Topanga Canyon, Topanga is a Chumash word. This is where all the rich celebrities live. Oprah needs to move. She's on our Chumash villages. If I ever see Oprah, I'll ask her about that. But what I'm saying is just is how in the concept, imagine being an American Indian person. Imagine being a Tongva descendant, Gabrielino descendant, and watching that news story. Bruce's Beach in Manhattan was given back to its original owners. Imagine the empathy you could have for that, what that's like for them to hear that. There was villages all up and down California. So I just want to bring that up in modern day sense of what we're dealing with. We're talking about, what do we do about that? I don't know. Right now, the California Governor's Office has a Truth and Healing Council. Truth and Healing Council has put together a commission to deal with that in terms of indigenous perspectives and how to heal from that. There's work that's being done there, but I just want to have you think about that. It's a bit political there as I share that with you, but this is California Indian pre-contact. But I'm going to say to you right now, very firmly and very sincerely, this is California now, post-contact, fall 2021. This is still California. We're not going anywhere. There are descendants here that are still tied to these indigenous tribes and communities. A lot of work was done to try to eradicate culture. And we're going to get to a concept before I'm done here today as we're talking about the role of erasure and the role of exclusion, which is leading to erasure, which I'm seeing happening a lot in indigenous countries across indigenous United States. If we're excluded from the conversation, I don't know if it's malicious or if it's intentful, it can lead to erasure. People not knowing these things. That video I just showed, that History and Hope, if you want to watch it, you can pull it up on YouTube. As I said, it was a lot of collaboration. A lot of non-Indian put their blood, sweat, and tears into that video to help train people about Humboldt County's, not necessarily the best of history, but also has a beautiful ending, which I'm going to share with you. I'm just showing a couple of clips today, but you wouldn't believe how many people I know born and raised in Humboldt County will tell me, and I work with graduate students, I teach in the social work department at Humboldt State, grad students and undergrads, who'll tell me, I never knew that history. I was born and raised in Eureka. So same thing I'd probably say for Kern County and Bakersfield, where I was raised. A lot of people don't know the Kern County history. Colonel Baker, which the city was named after, kind of a notorious land person there. Our library is named after Henry Beale, one of the first Bureau of Indian Affairs agents at Port Tejon. So we got this history that we don't talk about. How did the Southern Valley, how did the Central Valley become such an awesome breadbasket for the whole world of produce and growing all of our produce and vegetables and became what it is for the whole Central Valley of fertile? That was all full of indigenous tribes, land bases and villages. They even drained a lake in the middle of the Central Valley, why it's become so, we used to have a beautiful, awesome lake that was, there's a swampland area that was actually diverted with, the tribes had worked making like irrigation canals from it. But now it's a different place now. But that history is not known, but perhaps our charge now is to learn that history and talk about it. I'm gonna say this a few times. If we recognize history, even the not so fun parts, the stuff that hurts our hearts, that hurts our minds, gives us a headache, gives us butterflies in my stomach, our stomachs, perhaps we can heal from it and we become stronger as people and human beings together. And if we want to talk about patriotism, and perhaps it's an oxymoron or maybe irony, I think the more we talk about American history that has to do with attempted genocide on our indigenous peoples, we become stronger patriots as American people in general. Recognize that history. Don't erase it. Don't ignore it. Did something come in the chat or anything?
John Brunskill said the Manhattan Beach thing came up in my cultural geography. The question was, why not give it back to the first people? So kind of what you were touching on.
Yeah. Yeah, why not give it back to the person? I don't know. It's a lot of money. it's like $45 million at least. But no, it's interesting. And then we talk about some spiritual, cultural stuff. From what I'm aware, I'm just giving you my take on things. The idea of land ownership is very interesting in terms of indigenous perspective and spirituality and culture. I'm making very big generalities here, but yeah, at least an acknowledgement of it, perhaps. Yeah, it's a thought, but perhaps enough people know about it. Even this morning when I'm watching the news, I find myself getting older. I'm 46 years old now, so I have the day off. My office, at my work, you have the day off today. And so I was able to be here, which I'm very thankful for. But I'm drinking my coffee. I'm watching the Today Show. I kind of cycle between CBS Morning News and Today Show. There was no mention of Indigenous Peoples Day. By the way, they're not touching Columbus Day with a 10-foot pole, by the way, too. They're not saying anything. So what they're doing now is International Girls' Day or Women's Day. I noticed that today. Like, okay, we're going to sidestep that whole thing and we're going to throw another day out there, which is fine. I think people need to be empowered and help them kind of heal as well. There's all kinds of healing needs to take place. But I noticed, and you know that Joe Biden, our president, for the first time ever as a president, acknowledged Indigenous Peoples Day, made a proclamation this over the weekend. Pretty controversial, but he did it. That's amazing to see that happen. Anyway, if is there any comments or questions here from anybody here? Okay, feel free to just jump right in there. You want to insult me, you're good. You can interrupt me. This is where we're at in Humboldt County, by the way, our region, from Mendocino County to the above Santa Rosa. Look at how robust our area is in terms of our population. We have a ton of people that live here. Our tribes, rancherias and reservations, and different areas and communities. And some of you in this room are from those communities, or you know people who are from those communities. So it's a very robust place that we live in Humboldt, in the Delaware County, Humboldt North Coast region. I just wanted to highlight that. Very similar, I would say, to like Eastern San Diego County. A lot of tribes, reservations. And by the way, these are sovereign nations, a nation within a nation. They have their own governments, elected officials, leaders, tribal laws, mandates, sovereign nations. 2021, this is happening. This is where we're at now with the tribes. I just want to share a couple of slides here. A couple of my linguist friends have me talk about this so you know that pre-California, that there was a language hotspot. Because remember, in California, I had heard different numbers, but in the state of California, of course, there wasn't state lines. I'm talking to my sister over here from Arizona, Fort Mojave area. There was no boundaries back then. So there was tribes and trading happening all over the place. So you probably connect with the Chemehuevi people as well. And, there's the tribal people of Tehachapi, the Tawatables, I think is what they were called, the different tribes. Katanamak, Chumash, Lemne Yokas, trading. So there really was no border. But if we were to call California the border and acknowledge the border that is California, they were saying that in California, there was over 250 tribes just in California at one point. A lot of the tribes spoke a different language, different dialects. And do you know what, this is kind of a trick question. I don't know if it's funny or not. I hope you think it's funny, but a silly question. But how many tribal languages what would happen to someone if they only spoke one language back in the day? In Indigenous, way back, we're talking 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. What would happen to a tribal person if they spoke only one language? Any guesses? Yeah. They couldn't trade and talk to other people. They would starve. We had tribal people who spoke 3 to 4 different languages just to survive. That goes to native intelligence. That goes to indigenous knowledge. You had to speak different languages. And then when the Spanish arrived, early colonization that showed up, they spoke Spanish too as well. So you knew to speak Spanish along with your native languages to trade. So that idea of the knowledge and the intelligence that was there, it's already infused. Our descendants as tribal people have that knowledge of different languages. And that was probably the same across the board for any tribal folks across the United States as indigenous people, just for pure survival. So there's that. Language is a big deal. Just want to share this. I did a research study for my Cal State Long Beach Master's program. I'm just going to briefly go through these slides. I'm not going to go in depthly, but we're still dealing with some pretty sobering stats that we're kind of leading some categories that aren't good as tribal indigenous people. That American Indian adults are incarcerated at a rate that's 38% above the national average. If I were to go to the Humboldt County Jail right now, I'm willing to bet there's over 18 to 20% of Native Americans that are in there. Local Native American people are in Humboldt County Jail, our big fancy pink building that's in Eureka, men and women. So the rates are still high. Juvenile hall is getting better. The numbers are getting better, but across the country, the rates are higher. High school success, dropout rates, even the whole idea about attending higher ed. A lot of the tribal people, particularly this audience, but all of you in general, you're as awesome college students here. You are bucking the trend, particularly coming from a rural area, attending a higher ed education. It's awesome. But we see from studies that the dropout rate's 50% out of high school. In some places, even 85%. If you want, this is references. I don't expect folks to all remember this. I don't have it written down or anything. But Maria Braveheart Yellow Horse, she's Lakota out of, I believe, South Dakota. Maria Braveheart Yellow Horse does awesome work on the idea of historical trauma and the idea of what American Indian people do as Indigenous people of the United States and surviving historical trauma, boarding schools, massacres, loss of culture, all these things. So her work is this is a very powerful quote. Like children of Jewish Holocaust survivors, subsequent generations of American Indians also have a pervasive sense of pain from what happened to their ancestors. I learned a new term here, which I'm gonna look at a little bit more, particularly for my father and my mother. It's a fancy term, you don't have to remember, but it's called epigenetics. What does that mean? Your soul wound, perhaps. What's in your soul, what's in your spirit? Does that actually go into your DNA and you pass it along to your descendants? Some would say yes. So if we look at a term such as epigenetics, and I'm not a geneticist, I just pretend to be one right now, but the power of what that is, the enduring feeling of grief and loss. Because keep in mind, it's not a very happy topic, but we'll talk about it again. Keep in mind that whenever massacres occurred, people were fleeing and running. So you didn't have time to have a formal funeral service or a prayer to send them off that they need to be when they traditional ways to do that. Always running. So we have grief and loss that happened. Our boarding schools where children were sent and then died at the boarding schools and the families didn't even hear about it. This is all way before telephone. In some cases, even before the telegraph were even working. They didn't hear about their child dying until months later. So no idea of grief. So grief and loss and what that means. So epigenetics perhaps is something that's there, historical trauma. But I think of this, once again, Maria Braveheart Yellow Horse is a good reference for all of you. Is there a comment in the chat or something else? Or are we good?
No.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, man. Just the other federal Indian policies. Just know that, by the way, we have Harriet Tubman, and I even heard this might be a coin for Wilma Mankiller, I think, the first Cherokee chief, female Cherokee chief. Pretty soon coming out in the U.S. Mint, I believe a coin's going to be for her as a monetary currency. Andrew Jackson is a notorious, not a very nice person towards Indigenous people. But we have that there, what he did, that's kind of was a controversy where, but unfortunately our former person that was living in the White House actually had an oil portrait of Andrew Jackson in his office right behind him when he spoke, which is very symbolic, very disheartening to see that. Which is a nice contrast because now we have Joe Biden who has an awesome statue of Cesar Chavez behind him, which is really cool. But genocide, terminate, forced removal, assimilation, relocation in the 50s even, termination of rancherias, more federal policies, termination. So termination policy is a way to say, we recognize that you're a tribe, but by the way, your tribal rights, you are terminated as a tribe, you no longer exist. That happened in California, which led to people who just have descendancy. There's a lot of tribal people in California, Indigenous people, California Indians who do not have federal recognition because of the termination policy. There are a lot of tribal groups and communities in California particularly, and probably across the United States too, who are fighting for federal recognition because they know their families have ties to that. But termination policies was another way. It wasn't just boarding schools and massacres and all the scenes we see from like Dances with Wolves and things like that. It was a whole concerted law from Congress, United States Congress, what they did to actually attack tribal sovereignty, tribal identity. Relocation. So I think at this point, let's go ahead and show that second clip. Yeah. So I'm gonna share the second clip. And this individual, this is from the same History and Hope film. You can watch it on YouTube. It's available, History and Hope. As I said, it's from 2004. The second clip is currently the chief of police for the Yurok tribe. He worked for the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department for several years. It's a friend of mine. I know his family and his wife. I like what he says here. So I'm gonna ask all of you to really kind of pay attention to how he talks, what he says here at the end of this video. And we're also gonna show the end credits, a beautiful song. You'll see the pictures of there. And I wanna talk about the pictures that are shown when it goes into the end credits. So thank you, everybody. Almost, that's not really, it's gonna have something. It's quiet right there. Oh, that's not it. Yeah. Sounds just-
And I have the Bluetooth.
Special events. Our ceremonies, the native
Perfect. Thank you.
The native people of this area are still here and still have vibrant cultures. Despite the many problems we face, our people are healing generation by generation. There are very strong cultural and family ties that can be witnessed at our gatherings, sport tournaments, and special events. Our ceremonies help guide and heal us, and our elders continue to teach our history and our traditions. The youth are our future, and they continue to make us proud by achieving in areas such as education, healthcare, law enforcement, politics, social work, science, and natural resource management.
As a young person growing up, one of the overlying themes is we live in two worlds. We live in a dominant culture, and then we live in our traditional world, our traditional culture. It's always taught to me that it's important to be able to live and thrive in both. And to do that, I really think it's important, especially for communities and people who live near Indians and who live near Indian culture, to be able to get a look into it and see the beauty of it, see the power that it has, and realize that it's a culture that's ancient and we're still struggling to practice it. We have to give certain things up in another life to be able to do our culture, participate in our culture. Culture is not just during the summertime or during a dance. Culture is all your life. You're Indian all your life. And so you have to live your culture all your life, practice it all your life. And to be able to do that, sometimes it takes the understanding of maybe the school that you're in or your boss who you work for to be able to allow some time to be able to, for you to come and participate in your culture. And if we can share that with everyone and let people know that this is important to us, and regardless of how you feel, we're still going to practice and we're still going to participate. I know a day, I know a day, I know a day, I know. I know a day, I know a day, I know a day, I know. I know a day, I know a day, I know a day, I know a day, I know. I know a day, 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 I know a It's smoothing out. It is kind of nice. Kind of like
That's I just want to give credit. That's Yato Ainong, he's Yurok, and it's Greg O'Rourke, who's also Yurok. And I let that part kind of let that part show because it kind of they both people I'm aware of. I'm very privileged to know as cultural people who are part of dances or regalia makers, or maybe they gather acorns and they're good with cooking food for ceremonies, or the regalia makers. They have such a part in this community, but a lot of them are living the two worlds. Greg is the chief of police for the Yurok tribe, the largest tribe in California. They have a 6,500 plus tribal membership in the state of California. He's the chief of police for the tribe. It has a whole police force and staff with him. Yato has done a lot of work in the community with culture, does a lot with, still, this is a hunter, does a lot of things and, with teaching that kind of knowledge and like hiking and kind of knowing different routes. So someone I appreciate, but I always show that because it makes me laugh a little bit there. But for everyone that's here, kind of as we start, I kind of want to show little clips of that. Once again, the History and Hope is a video you can watch on YouTube. Take a look at. It's very much about Humboldt County there. But I'm wondering, what are folks so far? What we watched from these film clips, what are folks thinking right now? If there's any kind of questions or comments, what we just heard from Greg. He said a couple of concepts there that you may have caught on to as well. Yes, sir.
I've heard, my friends talk about that kind of thing, living in the two worlds. Being Mexican American, I identify with that too. It's like you can still live in your world, but be part of the rest of the American society.
Yeah.
Without, I think sometimes when they talk about the word like assimilation, they're like, oh no, you got to leave all that behind. I think nah, I'm completely opposite of that. I think you bring that with you. I think we need more of that. I think we need more of the traditional native culture in America to know what this land was like. Like there's been so much that's been lost to history. And like you were saying, people getting pretty much the genocide of people. I think we're missing a big part of what this country could potentially be. It's like just hearing stories. It's like, but with everything going on today, I think there's a lot of hope. I just think maybe there's not enough resources behind it, That's kind of where I'm at with that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think, and I appreciate the bravery to speak to that. I think the work of hope and living in two worlds, I find it interesting because I think America does acknowledge, well, I think we are living in a post, not even post, we have such indigenous influence all over this country. A lot of our highways and trails wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the original trails that were built. I think of kayaking. That's indigenous. Our food. All the stuff that we spend $1 million off at the co-op and Wildberries, by the way. That's all indigenous foods that my great-grandparents were gathering and using. That's indigenous. So America seems to be adopting in some weird kind of way, I guess. Ironically enough, it's the most expensive stuff you buy at the grocery store. It's unique and different. But, and the role of spirituality, like living every day as a spiritual person, you wake up praying, you go to bed praying, you fasting, you're the role of spirituality. Some would say, I think universally, Christian or not, brush dance, fix the earth people, Chumash people, folks from Mojave, they would say the world needs a lot of fixing right now on a spiritual level. Trying to get it back up. You have all these prayers and ceremonies that are happening. We've had local ceremonies recently where they're attempting they're actually some of the translations and what I've heard, the English very kind of a crude way of saying it, but it's English. They're fixing the earth. They literally are fixing the earth. We have ceremonies where they fix the earth. Not just with fixing like physical earth, they're fixing the spirituality, what's going on with the world with illness and sickness and anger, resentment, sadness, fixing it, cleaning it away, wiping it away. I've seen that not only up here, but throughout California, but across the United States, the role of it. What does that mean for spirituality?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Didn't we just have the Humboldts just have a dance about that too?
They sure did.
And that was a 10-day thing, and I haven't been there for decades.
Mm.
And I went up there Saturday and Sunday, and that was a great feeling just to be there.
Mm. How many years you say?
I haven't been up there since I was 12, and I'm 60.
Holy moly. Wow.
So you know, it was a great feeling just to be back up there in that land. And on Sunday, I think we stayed there until the end, until they danced away home.
Yeah. The knowledge is there. We just have I want to appreciate our colleagues sharing that beautiful story. I'm not a really good math major, but what is that, 48? Did I just do it? Is that 48 years? Wow, 12 by 60? 48 years in between attending a dance and going. And they're still there because that's still who they are, always has been. Even that 48 years that dance is always, you've been there, you've had that connection, ties. But I think fixing the earth is something we're talking about. Once again, thank you for sharing that beautiful story. I think when we talk about Indigenous Peoples Day, it is talking about all those things, not just the political stuff I've been talking about, language, land back. It's also spirituality. It's also mentally, how do we deal with identity and connection to community? We know from a child development standpoint that children growing up, a sense of community, a sense of need, a sense of purpose is very important for their well-being. So how do we do that? And I teach this in my classes, it's cross-cultural. A lot of this stuff is pretty universal. Like our brother here, from Mexico, as you said, yeah. Our Mexican brother over here, very similar. Indigenous roots there too, but very similar with the idea of identity, sense of community, family, whatever family looks like, by the way. It could be aunties, tias, tios, aunties and uncles, grandparents. In my language, we say kekich is our family, kekich. Ichantik is our friends. But one big takeaway from today is celebrating Indigenous People Day and recognizing this is through this. If this is all thought-provoking, that's what we want you to think about, is the role of all these things. The politics of being Indigenous, the spirituality of being Indigenous. What does that mean? The environmental impacts of that. We haven't even touched upon climate change. My scientists and my TEK brothers and sisters out there, my traditional ecological knowledge people are like, hey, Vincent, what about that? Well, they know I'm a social service guy. And I'm still recovering from failing my zoology class 20 years ago. So I try not to talk too much about that. But anyway, but that traditional ecological knowledge makes sense too. We're excited about, from the political, but also environmental, we're excited about what's going to happen when the dams come down. How the river is hopefully going to recover it and salmon are going to come back. And there's a spiritual essence there too. Like when the salmon come back, the people are going to get better. The rivers are going to flow. Things are going to get back in balance again, we're hoping. Even for, I think of people who gather acorns or even mussels that were, the wild mussels along the coastal cliffs and the rocks where people gather mussels, the edible mussels or even abalone. There's times when people who are the gatherers of those abalones, traditional people, be it Taloa, Deni, Taloa, Yurok, Wiats, who are gathering abalones, and even some of the coastal Pomo folks in the Mattole region who gather mussels and abalone, they know not to take the whole rock off. They're not going to pretty much just pillage the whole rock and just take every single mussel. They leave some there. In fact, a lot there. They take what they need. And so that you don't over harvest. You look things in balance. Because there's also a thinking that that's being greedy, being selfish. And the world will come back at you and say, okay, you're going to be selfish like that? We're not going to have any good mussels next year. These are all toxic the next year. It can happen that way. Same thing now where I come from. We have elderberries that we pick. We do it for our clapsticks, but also for teas. Sage, our white sage is where it comes from. A lot of people know about the white sage from California. It comes from our territory in Chumash country. We know that there's huge groves of white sage that pretty much get taken by people, ends up in store shelves, and it doesn't grow back. And guess who suffers? People who need that. Because we use that for healing. Things such as that. So I kind of went off a little tangent here, but this when we talk about celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, it's all these things. Yes, sir.
So something that you touched on that actually brought back memories of my great-grandpa. So my great-grandpa was Purepecha native in Mexico. He was, he was mestizo, but his father was Purepecha. His mother was half Purepecha and then Spanish. And he spoke the native tongue out there. And he spoke Spanish, he spoke the native, and then he spoke English because he lived here for so many years. But one thing that always stays with me is that he told me that something that was implemented from his grandfather was that only take what you need, never take more than that. And if you do that, life in the world will replenish what you need. And that's something that I was thinking about when you were talking like that. That's exactly what it was, a teaching that he's had. And what was incredible to me was like, growing up and hearing these stories from him, it's you're bringing a lot of those memories back from me, like you're touching on the subject. It touches to my heart. I appreciate that, bringing that up, because he meant a lot to me, because he always told me that, like, even though the native part, in Mexico was always kind of pushed to the side, but in the essence, he's like, don't forget that that's a big part of who you are. He's like, you will, no matter where you go, that is a part of who you are.
Yes.
So he's like, it's up to you. I remember him telling me, he's like, it's up to you, your generations, to bring that back. I just wish I would have learned the language, but when the native people would come down from the hills and sell aguacates and sell, everything that they sew together, like nuts and these other, things, he would speak to them in their language. He would speak to them and trade with them and talk to them in their language, and then he would talk to us in Spanish and English. So it was incredible, but yeah, it was yeah. I also believe kind of in the spirituality. I knew I needed to come in here. Maybe that's what I needed to hear.
Yeah. We're all human. I have my ups and downs, and you guys are catching me on a lucky morning too. I actually had my coffee in time, so I'd be a real grumpy jerk if I didn't have my coffee. But no, but thank you. I'm just teasing. But no, but thank you for that. I'm very honored to share that from your heart, particularly. I want to touch upon something there too, which I'm going to get to my next couple of slides here. But I talked about language a little bit, but what you just shared with our colleague just shared here. The folks coming down from the hills, there's an indigenous perspective, be it folks coming down from a mesa in Arizona, or a Hogan or a Pueblo speaking that language. We're not just talking about language that's over 100 years old. We're talking about people speaking indigenous languages that are 10,000 years old. I'm going to challenge the scientists out there, the anthropologists, the cultural folks out there. 10,000 years old, these languages at least were being spoken. So if we have an indigenous person speak those in the language, and you're not able to communicate, be it in Mexico, as we know, our brothers from the South, in what we now know as North America, all the way to Alaska, these languages that were spoken over 10,000 years and still being spoken today. So when I sing my Chumash songs and I sing songs and prayers, these are languages that are used from thousands of years ago. And that's a tie that we don't give up. That's still there. Regardless, in 2021, we're speaking those languages and learning them. Not perfect at it, but we are also, I also want to acknowledge my own privilege, and perhaps a lot of us as Native people today, our power and privilege is that we're able to do so, because back then it was illegal to speak language. You'd be arrested. You'd be taken to boarding school. Folks that may have known this already, but I'm going to share, I think it's a big factor when we talk about why we celebrate having Indigenous Peoples Day, but from going back to the history that we have to know about, how much we've endured. We have Secretary Howland is now Deb Howard, who's now our Secretary of the Interior, first time, particularly as a Native woman, Indigenous woman, as our Secretary of the Interior, Deb Howland. American Indian people weren't even citizens of the United States until 1924. That's a fact. American Indian people were not even citizens of the United States until 1924. So prior to that, you had no rights as an American citizen. There was no civil rights. So when we talk about civil rights of the 60s and everything like that, imagine what American Indian people were going through. We had Indian agents for the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the government, agents from the federal government telling families, if you do not send your 3-year-old to a boarding school, imagine you having a 3-year-old and have to give them up to a boarding school. They would have to shoot me dead if I would have to do that. You give up your 3-year-old to go to a boarding school, you're not getting your foods for this week. You're not getting your rations. Therefore, your family would starve. What a choice to make. But that happened. It was like extortion. It was blackmail. And then to go to the boarding schools where religious faiths were in charge of each boarding school. We had some Baptists running one, Lutherans, Catholics were running these boarding schools. And the assumption was that any American Indigenous person that landed in those schools was morally bankrupt, did not have spirituality. That's a falsehood. The audacity for anybody to land in an Indigenous society and tell them they didn't have spirituality, it's just pure ignorance. Once again, traditional culture, religion, spirituality was going on for tens of thousands of years, predating a lot was out, as we know, as modern day Christianity. So that's something that needs to be kind of, accountability needs to happen there when we talk about that, because it was the audacity, the basic thesis and premise, and using fancy university College of the Redwoods talk here, premise thesis is, you are lacking spirituality, we're here to save you. Who are you saving? You don't need to save these folks. They already have spirituality. They already have ties to a creator. They have that ties on them. But power structure at that time, just that's kind of the, if we're really going to be honest about this and heal, we need to recognize that. Did you have your hand raised, Bruce?
Yeah, I'm still thinking of it though.
Okay. We had a hand over. You're being very patient. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Any comments from the online at all?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Max. Max is doing great, by the way. Just want to go into like communication styles, and before I get wrapped up here, before I get finished, I do want to have a little conversation about exclusion and erasure, which I think in 2021 is a big deal. It's happening now, subtly, if not pretty overtly. Exclusion and erasure. But I have these slides up here. I'm going to sit down and kind of show them, just kind of take a look at the idea of communication. I share this slide with a lot of social workers I've trained and different people I work with, probation officers and people in the community, with the idea of kind of talking about communication styles, the role of humor. You guys have noticed me trying to be humorous. I'm not very funny, but I try. My wife's watching right now. My kids are probably, oh God, Dad, please don't. By the way, I love those Progressive insurance commercials. That is me. I am those parents. I act that way in an airport. I act that way in a mall. If you guys know what I'm talking about, the reference, I'm sorry. I love pop culture, people who know me, but yeah. It makes me sad when I watch those Progressive insurance commercials because I do everything those parents do. And I don't even own a damn house. Storytelling is huge. You might even heard our brother over here sharing stories about his family. That was storytelling. He walked us through a journey there, which we're very blessed and honored to hear, along with our sister here sharing their stories and their ties. When we're talking with tribal community people, it's what you take and you kind of hear people's story. Any exchange can be therapeutic, cathartic in psychological terms. Tell your story. Things need to be said. He just shared something with me too, which I'm flattered about. He said, maybe I'm meant to be here now. I feel like a connection of spiritually or kind of from a heart level. Yeah, that's kind of what we're talking about here, that kind of work. But this is an Indigenous perspective that I've seen all over the place. I've been in Washington State. I'm just a redneck Chumash kid from Bakersfield. I've been to Washington State with some tribal people up there. I used to work for 7th generation fund. I remember having elders who I've never met in my life up in Washington State. So I'm talking some people who live in that life, where they live in those, they have their cedar houses and their ceremonies and beautiful hand drums and sing with storytellers, elders, pulling me aside and saying, come here. I'm like, oh, they wouldn't do that, but they go talk to them and like, hey, there's something about you. I need to talk to you. And like touching my heart, but they saw like kind of where I was coming from. So that kind of like the role of spirituality, it's genuineness, it's humanity, it's communication that's genuine. And I don't know, I'm trying not to make too many generalizations, but particularly our tribal youth, those who are even struggling, those youth that we throw away, that we send to community schools or probation schools, or just tribal youth in general, they can read people pretty quickly. They know, and some of you might know on a cross-cultural level, some of our kids who struggle, no matter what their ethnicity is, our kids are youth because they're not corrupted yet as being adults. They can read people pretty quick. They know if you're full of crap. And I see that particularly with our tribal youth, our tribal folks. They know kind of, where they're coming from, or at least they kind of understand, do I trust this person or not? So trust is really big. So along with these slides, I'm kind of going off my little thing there, but storytelling is huge. You're gonna listen and observe more than you speak when you're talking with folks. Not making assumptions. Ask questions if it's a appropriate way to do so. If you have trust and rapport with people, ask questions. If you feel like you have permission to do so, or ask for permission. Hey, do you mind if I ask a question? I'm kind of curious. I'm not really from here. What about this? It's good questions to ask. Laughter for sure is good medicine. A lot of tribal folks surviving the boarding schools, historical trauma, loss of culture, having to regain that, the work that it takes to do that, heartache, soul wounds, laughter is huge. Indirect communication. You're not necessarily going to get that. Maybe perhaps it's my Irish side. My mama, by the way, for the record, my brother ran a DNA test. We know about my father, but my mom, I share the story. All my friends will probably get sick of me saying it all the time. But in the last year, we ran a DNA test on my mom, and she literally is 100% Irish. And she's from the western side of Ireland, from the same community. I say that because my mom was pretty direct. I grew up with a lot of African-American friends in Bakersfield, in the city where I grew up in, and she acted a lot like those African-American grandmas, very similar. So nothing would really shock me. But what I'm saying is the role of tribal communities may not be so direct communication. I don't know why maybe something's having me talk about this here, but you may be in a meeting. You're not necessarily going to see tribal people go after another tribal person in a meeting. They're not going to insult somebody in the middle of a meeting. They're going to wait till a better time to talk to them. So when we see non-Indian people act a certain way in a meeting where maybe people are being attacked or being rude to each other, that doesn't happen so much in tribal meetings. It does maybe in private settings, but I'm making not so much. It does happen, but there's always exceptions. But my point is, I think of HSU University where I worked for many years. We'd have our tribal meetings and we're amongst each other, especially when we had other non-Indian people in a meeting amongst us as tribal people. We wouldn't go out of our way to bash Native people in front of other non-Indian people. We'd find a better way to do that later in a good way to talk to them, offer critique, to be helpful. So I just think there's some communication style that's there. So my overall point of that, I share that, and I'll share it with you as I've shared with social workers and probation officers throughout the years, is just because tribal people are in a room with you, you don't hear any kind of different opinion or they're quiet, doesn't mean they agree with it. You can't assume agreement. You have to go the extra mile to ask what's going on. What feedback can you give me, or what is your opinion? Let's talk about this. This is just a little side note there. This is a beautiful picture of all these language speakers in California, Middle California, a few years back. The revitalization of California Indian language and languages across the United States is huge. It's telling the boarding schools you didn't work, you were not effective. We're still here, we're still practicing culture, we're still speaking our language regardless of what you did to us. Just want to talk about what we're still dealing with today. The role that's kind of leading into my discussion, I was kind of wrapping up today, and I'll ask for some overall general questions for the folks online on Zoom, but also folks here presently. We are still dealing with bigotry and stereotypes as tribal people. I want to applaud Major League Baseball and the Cleveland baseball team for getting rid of this logo, mascot, racist logo. But look at that, that's horrible. If that was an African American or Chicano or an Asian kind of a stereotype drawn image, that would be a huge uproar. This gentleman literally put red makeup on for the old Washington NFL team game during a Monday Night Football game in 2015. That was only 6 years ago. And of course, Peter Pan, which we like to show our kids, right? What makes the red man red? I don't know. I've never really seen a red man, but okay. Outkast, which I like hip hop music. I like Big Boy, and I like Andre 3000. But their performance at the Grammys in 2000 was pretty amazing. You know, pretty sad. Did a whole like chanting and drumming, and his line before they performed was, "The natives are definitely restless." So the role of stereotypes, even amongst our own minority brothers and sisters, is still a battle that we still have to kind of learn. I couldn't help but notice during the Washington NFL dialogue to get rid of the mascot for Washington, which was the Redskins, by the way, which is a direct reference to historical documentation that Redskins were actually the name given to the scalps that were taken for bounties. And in California alone, the federal government paid militia groups to go out and get scalps of Native men, women, and children. Over close to $1 million was paid out for those bounties just in the state of California. And when you see the documentation, it was referred to as Redskins. So that was the big problem with that name. But what I noticed also was the amount of other minority football players, African-American football players, Chicano football players, men and women defending the name and wondering why it's such a big deal. So ignorance has no bounds. With our brothers and sisters cross-culturally, there's a lot of acknowledgement where don't exclude us in this BIPOC conversation. We know the eyes there, but do you really mean that?
Is that why Washington changed their name?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's because the corporation said if you don't change your name, we're taking all of our money. That's why they did it. So Nike, Adidas, all kinds of people, and even the NFL said, "Oh, by the way, you're not going to get a new stadium unless you change the name." So politics came into play, but the pressure was because of that. They learned, yeah, the power of people. That lady on the horse at the middle page, that's a Victoria's Secret model, by the way, during a fashion show. That was in the last 20 years too. And of course, Steven Seagal. Who can forget Steven Seagal? Sorry, I don't even know the guy. Some of the movies are all right, but he's got this whole native persona to him, right? Anyway. But I just want to, as I'm kind of, just some things I'm kind of talking about here. When we're talking about celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, we're still struggling with bigotry, stereotypes, prejudice. But also the other thing I want to talk about too is, if we were to go back very recently, and as I'm wrapping up my final comments here, and I want to take some questions from the audience. And I think we're going to be, what is the word I'm looking for? We're going to be amiss if we don't talk about this. I might be remiss, I guess, what people say. If we don't talk about the 2020 election of Biden when he won. Do we all know what happened in Arizona, the state of Arizona, which was a very huge win for the first time a Republican winning there, or excuse me, a Democrat winning, beating a Republican? You mind sharing?
They went blue state, but it was most native voted that time in that election.
Yeah.
For Biden.
Thank you. Our colleague here just said they went blue states because most Native Americans, a lot of Native Americans voted for Biden. You know what CNN, quote unquote, a progressive channel said? Yeah. CNN listed the demographics of who voted for Biden. They said African American, Hispanic, Chicano, Asian American, and they put something else. They didn't even put Native American. Although the population of Arizona, I believe, was probably 24, 25% Native American. And they know the vote was super high for Native, but they put something else. So the next thing we had all these Native activists saying, we're more than something else. We're actually here. We're alive. We're Indigenous people. So this stuff is still happening. Once again, the Bruce's Beach, Manhattan Beach issue that came up, that's still happening now today. That's exclusion, to not be part of these conversations. We talk about that. Also erasure. If you don't talk about them, maybe we don't exist. But I think of my father who's 89 years old. I think of my children. I think of the language bearers. I think of the dance holders and the dance people struggling to have dances. I think of us as tribal, as Chumash people in Southern California, having to get a permit to go access our land, to go to our churches, not really churches, but sacred site areas to even go there. We have to get federal forestry people to give us access to our sacred site areas. We have people now fighting for access through state parks, through the federal government to go get access to gather stuff like their acorns, basketry materials. This is stuff that's still going on that we don't hear about. But once again, ignorance that's out there is the idea of kind of the role of exclusion. Native Americans, how do we talk about 2021 Indigenous Peoples Day. What are we going to do for ourselves to help, for ourselves, but also for all of you to help contribute is stopping that exclusion. We're going to ask all of you, though, those online and folks that are here, how do we stop the exclusion? Include that conversation that's always happening. I always think to myself, what's the Native perspective there when I see all these things happening? Like this morning, no mention of Indigenous Peoples Day at all. Not even Biden's proclamation that happened over the weekend. CBS News or Today Show did not mention it. It's probably going to be on NPR, but maybe 20 people watch that. Sorry, I like NPR. But yeah, it's not in the local, it's not in national media. All these things of ignorance and stuff like the idea here. I want a couple of things of references here for all of you here. Is we want to fight the exclusion and we certainly want to fight the erasure because the work is still there to be done. But cross-culturally, collaborating with each other as a community is very important. And as I have these resources here, I'm going to leave that with you and I'm going to open up for questions or comments. And I love to dialogue with people that are online on Zoom and for our folks who are live. I want to share one last story with all of you. This is how it's been told to me. Folks may have heard of what we have now. A lot of justice has taken place in our local area, and I commend our local government, along with our tribal, particularly our Indigenous people of this area, the Wiyot tribe, Table Bluff, Bear River, and Blue Lake. The land back, we got Indian Island. I may not be saying the name correctly. I don't know the actual native name. There's a name to that area. The Wiyot massacre that occurred in 1860. I was around 20 plus years ago when they were doing vigils, and we'd go and share Chumash songs and sing with people to help vigils that were happening with Cheryl Seidner and her family and the tribal folks. Now that island has been given back to the Table Bluff people and the Wiyot people in general. That Wiyot massacre, as and I could be incorrect, but from what I'm aware of, that Wiyot massacre would not have been known across the country if it wasn't for a non-Indian gentleman named Bret Hart. I share that. Bret Hart got on the telegram. He was living in Uniontown at the time, which is now we call it Arcata. So when you look up local Humboldt County history, Arcata used to be called Uniontown. He got on his telegraph and reported all the way to the New York Times at that time, all the way across the country to the East Coast about the massacres that occurred. He kind of said, this can't be happening. He kind of told what happened. Subsequently, he and his family were threatened by their life to get out of town. He was chased out of town, him and his family, for sheer death of their lives were threatened, so he had to leave. I share that story because this is Indigenous Peoples Day, but it's also a collaborative potential for all of us to work together as human beings, as a society, working together, helping each other out, collaborating, creating bridges, helping advocate for each other, as Bret Hart did to help. But of course, the Native people, the endurance that it took for the Native people to keep their languages alive, healing from the tragedy that happened. We're talking, there was just a few babies that were kept alive on the island that happened that night. So just really horrific circumstances. But the idea of telling the truth, we all could be truth tellers. We can all change history. We all could look at correct people, talk about it. My son, who's 15, was just in his history class, European history class, and he read it. My son, you imagine my son, how he's gonna have to go. My wife is an educator. She's works for Yurok Tribe Education. I do what I do. We're both kind of activists. My poor kid, he probably could never go to a history class like a normal kid, but he's pretty sharp too. But he came out one night, he was reading his history book, and he said, man, look at this paragraph. And the paragraph was, the Spanish came in the mission systems and taught them how to pray. My son's like, what? Tell us how to pray. We know how to pray. He was all fired. I said, yeah, son. So my thought is, why would a teacher not stop and pause and go, let's just talk about that? They knew how to pray. Spirituality was there in existence for 10,000 years. But first, you got to recognize that Indigenous people were here. They are Indigenous. First off, we're going to actually be able to get that to roll off our tongue now. Indigenous. Do we dare to say that? Indigenous. But I just want to share that story with you, the Bret Hart, the idea of collaborating, learning from each other, cross-cultural histories, recognize that we are as humans together. So here's some resources. The ITEP program, Indian Teacher Educational Personnel Program, Indian Tribal Educational Personnel Program at Humboldt State University. There's some great people there. They have their own curriculum center there with all kinds of tribal DVDs, videos, books, maps. Come check them out, especially when things open up for COVID. The Canary Effect is on YouTube. It's free. Please watch that. It's a very hard-hitting film about historical trauma. Also talks about up until like 2015, some incidents of what's happening in Indian country. Canary Effect is huge. Another good resource is the National Indian Child Welfare Association. The Indian Child Welfare Act, which was in direct response years later from the boarding schools and survival of that, where we're up until 1970s, we still had a significant amount of American Indian children were taken away from Native families and shipped off to non-Indian families outside of their communities. Therefore, loss of culture, loss of identity, leading to mental health issues. So ICWA was created in 1978. That's under attack right now. The Supreme Court is looking at ICWA in the next couple of days, just so you know. Indian Child Welfare Act. So look that up, ICWA. Another thing, folks that are out there and also here, I show it to a lot of my classes, another film. It used to be on Netflix. I don't know why, because a lot of people are talking about Hollywood exclusion of all minority cultures, but somehow they took it off Netflix and Hulu. It's actually a film called Real Engine. It talks about the Native American history in Hollywood. Real horrible, despicable stereotype. Kind of funny. It's so silly, it's funny, but the stereotype, bigoted images of Native Americans in Hollywood and what that meant. So look at the name of that film is Real Engine, RELINJUN, Real Engine. It's available. I had to get it another way through a library, but along with these resources there. So that's what I have for all of you. Are there any questions for folks here in the audience? Any online? Yes, go ahead.
Well, I don't have a really question. It's more back to like the generational trauma and the cross-culturally learning from each other. It's like as I said before, my dad speaks fluent. But one thing is like I don't, and he never taught me. And like now when I bring it up to him, it's like a joke to him. But like when I was younger and he would tell me stories of like what his mom went through in boarding school, and like, you know, she like kept the language obviously, but like he was telling me like everything he like what she went through. And it's like I don't think people realize how badly that affects people. Like that even my mom doesn't speak the own language because my grandma, her mom was scared to teach her it because she actually wanted her to fit more into American society rather than like live in two different worlds. And like another thing I see a lot, like we're not trying to, or down south more per se, is like a lot has been lost, like, you know, like the bird songs. So and people are like picking and choosing what songs are they going to sing or who are they going to take it from. And it's like more people are trying to say, this is my family's thing, or these are my family songs, like you can't sing these. So it's a lot of like bumping heads. And it's like, I don't know, like for me, it's like, I just don't see why people don't see like what we have left is what we have left. Why can't we just like, you know, like collect that together, or like, you know, try to come together with language and try to, instead of trying to like say it's like, you can't have like gatekeeping in a way from different tribes. Like the tribes that were separated, the Mojave, the Pisans, the Chimaledes, all of them, like they're like fighting with each other of like which language is the correct language. And it's like it makes it a lot more difficult to like try and want to revive it, even for myself. Like I continuously ask my dad and he just like will not teach me at all. It's like it's really hard on me.
I want to thank you for sharing that, because that's very real. I think we all should be honored to hearing that from you. I mentioned exclusion and erasure. As Native people, because we're survivors of historical trauma, we exclude each other sometimes. In Chumash country, where I come from, we have 7 different dialects. And I have some Chumash people strictly speaking Ventureño Chumash language, and Ineseño, which is San Ynez, and they won't talk. So I'm like, okay, well, I want some words so I can pray and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, and I didn't talk about today. I couldn't touch everything. I mean, this could be like a 2-semester class, by the way, I could teach, but and I don't know if I'd be the right expert to do that, but I was kind of giving you some things to start, at least get some thoughts going. But from what our colleague just shared with us here, I didn't talk about assimilation, survival. My dad being a Chumash descendant, born and raised in Bakersfield by a single mother, brothers went to World War II, came back with their own like shell shock, what we now call as PTSD from the war. His brothers passed away early. His dad passed away when my dad was 9 years old, drunk, being hit by a car. My dad was sent away to a seminary, which is what you did, in 8th grade in Oakland. And he had never left that area. So he tells that story. He barely told that story to me about 20 years ago, sitting down looking at a photo, and he was sobbing, telling me the story. I didn't know about it. But he didn't tell any of us siblings, but I'm the youngest, and he told me. But so the history is very real. Assimilation, survival. Perhaps it is, I don't want you to go through what I went through because I don't want you to have that pain. But now we're saying we are more empowered now. We have a little bit more privilege. We want to learn the language. So it's a risk just to know that. It's healing just to speak the language. I've been in recovery groups with Native men at UHS who were still in their suspenders from working out in a mill. This is when mills were still open in Humboldt County, go figure. But there's a logging mill, and the guy came in, he was in a recovery group. I used to teach a red rope curriculum. I remember this one guy had redwood sawdust all over him and pine pitch, all kinds of stuff. We had suspenders on him sitting in group. It was a mandated group because the probation said he had to go. I had him in tears because we were simply talking about tribal basketry and basketry of Native women in our local area doing baskets. And he said, the guy was a big old guy too. Once again, in all that logging gear, sobbing because he told everybody, similar to our colleague here saying that 48 years ago was the last time they went to a dance up in Hoopa. He was saying, I've not heard about basketry. It makes me think of my auntie. It's been like 30 years since I've been talking about that. So the power of that healing and assimilation is so real. So what do? We have to find those who are willing to share it and find that kind of connection. And once again, it's collaboration. Sometimes some of the best language people are the people who've done all the cataloging work. Like for the Chumash, sometimes it's the anthropologist. Damn it, who's done the work. We have to go out and go to the wax cylinder recordings from Berkeley. John Harrington. If it wasn't for Harrington, the Chumash people, we wouldn't have a lot of our songs because assimilation did a hell of a work. The missions did a hell of a job. They tried, but I'm still here. My son's still here. My dad's still here. But thank you for sharing that. But the role of assimilation is so powerful. And how do we keep enduring? But as Native people, yeah, we need to heal ourselves too, to not exclude each other, which is tough. But we're all healing. There's so much hurt there. Read and then next one.
Oh, just for comment that what you described was part of the strategy for taking over was divide and conquer. And I think it still holds true. Like we're still, that's how we lose when we're divided.
A colleague in the back for those online just said that's part of the strategy is divide and conquer. Very systematically done, purposely done to divide and conquer us. It's fighting amongst ourselves. So how do we overcome that? When we say Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, how do we uncover? How do we endure that? How do we go beyond that? Yeah. Thanks, Reed. Max?
Yeah, so something that I wanted to touch on like kind of like assimilation and erasure is just like for myself trying to get in touch with any sort of knowledge, because like, you know, my parents are from El Salvador, which is, you know, below the US, and I feel like below the US, like a lot of Indigenous like identity has been erased through the label of Hispanic or Latina, whatever, like all those phrases. It's like, okay, you have like one drop of Spanish blood, now you're not Indigenous. So it's like a different type of erasure, and trying to get in touch with that. And like even now it's like Hispanic Heritage Month, and that's like a bit frustrating. Like it starts with you know, basically like several countries like Independence Days, and it's like to celebrate that, it's like, okay, celebrating the 4th of July or something. And yeah, I just feel like there's a whole conversation there that's complicated, even with like what I assume would be my like, I guess, Indigenous ancestry would be with like the people in like Central America. And it's like, even with them, it's like there was so much like migration and evidence that like they were like trading and going up as far as like Utah. Then like at some point we're in like the Aztec kingdom, and then like got like they like fled due to violence and like that whole, and then like went down to Central America. So I don't really know what my question is, but yeah.
Well, just for folks, that's Max, and thank you for sharing your heart with us and saying that out loud. I'm sort of sensing, if I may, I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to be bold. Inspiration. I want you to be inspired to find that out. Talk to people. Reach out from the community and learn about it. Research it. Study it if you can. Aunties, uncles, cousins, people you might have connections with. Like, just ask them if they've had that, and if it's still, then keep learning. Try to reach out. You're talking to some real powerful stuff, which is what we. And I know we're using these terms like Central America, right?
Mm-hmm.
San Salvador, El Salvador. But those all have village names. What that might be a place to start too is what were the indigenous names to those areas, because they're there. We can look them up and find out what that is, and that could also be very telling too.
Mm-hmm.
And you were spitting some knowledge there, which was awesome, which is the trade all the way up into the Americas. There's stories about that too. Like how did abalone end up in the middle of Mexico? You know, or abalone end up all the way, you know, in Montana. It was traded, you know, or and other stuff, you know, all these items, so things were, but so there's a connection of an indigenous world. But I'm hearing from you, it's just one exciting time if you're able to do so, is to research it and talk to people and find that path. Because there's something that's calling you.
Yeah, and then it's definitely just like added difficulty, because like, for example, like my grandma, who like, you know, it's not like I've ran like a DNA test on her, but like I'm almost certain that she's like full like Indigenous, but she like does not, like, you know, like I don't know how many times like I grew up like just hearing like negative things about like darker skin, like, you know, just like certain like pejorative phrases in Spanish that like indicate negative feelings towards like Native people and stuff, even though she was like, you know, so it's just like lots of like generational harm. And then like yeah, it's like interesting for my sister and I to like try and do more research on this, and my parents don't really care, so it's like, it's interesting.
Self-hate, non-love for ourselves, feeling of not feeling worthy. We have to get back to that. The colonization, boarding schools did a hell of a number on us. So we have to recover. So how do we recognize it? What do we do? I'm throwing out these arbitrary questions. It's not really an answer for it. What I mean is, it was effective, but how the trick is, how effective do we want it to be as we move forward? How do we stop it? And we can do it little pieces here and there. Part of it is, and I'm in my house, and my wife and I, we tease him. My 15-year-old, he's got a tape of our uncle was singing all of our Chumash songs. He's incessantly listening to that. He's also listening to his kind of ceremonial songs, which was given to him. So in a stereo in his room, and he's singing. I'm like, man, God, would you stop singing? I had to stop myself. What the hell am I doing? Tell him to stop. But think about how cool that is. I was just a little, excuse my language, I was a little punk ass 15-year-old angry kid fighting people all over the place when I was that age. He has his moments too, trust me, but I love him. But what I'm saying is how beautiful it is that we have children now, particularly in our North Coast area, where all they know is their ceremony. They're born in a baby basket, the same baskets that were made thousands of years ago, and they were rocked to sleep in those baskets. The language, they've been given names that are traditional names. So it's a step, little steps we could take, starting points. And 500 plus tribal nations, so much levels of work. We'll take a question over here and then we'll get someone from the audience there too. Aaliyah? 5 minutes, okay, 5 minutes. We'll take a question here and then one from the audience online. Thank you for being patient, everybody out there.
Just to answer that, like I struggled with that kind of, not knowing exactly what my history was and all that other stuff. But like I said, my great grandpa told me that we like having indigenous blood in me, that kind of thing. He always said a phrase. He was like, "La sangre llama sangre." Your blood will always call your own blood, And what he always told me is that anytime you have a curiosity about where you're from, follow it. Because obviously your DNA is telling you to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So that I've taken that to heart, and that's why I'm so interested in Native American culture in general, because a part of me is that, and a part of me was lost to that, And to add to that, I had a kind of a spiritual experience when my son was born. The doctor, when she was checking him, was like, she said, your history carries through your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
But you can change that from here on out. If it's a bad history, improve that. So you can change the outlook of what your history is to your son. You don't have to let it determine what he's going to live through. And that triggers something in
Wow.
I've had those experiences. And even just working out, I worked at Bear River for over 13 years. I have a lot of friends that are from that tribe that will be my friends forever. But it was almost like an awakening for me, just being up here and not knowing anything about it. It was really deep to me, knowing that there are people that are very similar to what I was going through, and that those things of losing that, because when you're in Mexico and you grew up poor, the government doesn't want you. When you come to the Americas and you come here, they don't want you. So like, it's hard combining all that, but as you get older, and lucky for me, I have Native friends in the Native culture. It's like almost you find strength in the struggle, if that makes any sense, And I'm like, okay, that's why I believe that I was supposed to be here today to maybe refresh this in my mind. I think you made that certain for me. Unfortunately, I got to go to class. I appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you too. Thank you.
So much.
And we'll take a question from the audience. I want folks to also, before we get to the question, Dr. Michael Yellowbird talks about healing the neurotransmitters from historical trauma. People who endure, you can actually rewire the neurotransmitters for trauma and rewire it for healing. So Dr. Michael Yellowbird's work is very powerful. Look at that. What's the question for that?
Yeah, so Jessica Bedell says, I'm moved by this presentation. Thank you for sharing. What local tribal organizations are involved in protecting botanical areas and local indigenous peoples' access to the materials you mentioned?
California Indian Basket Weavers, SIBA. Also, several of the tribes, Yurok tribe, Hoopa tribe, have natural resources department of forestry of the tribes. That also goes to Delaware County, Tolowa tribe. So SIBA is a big advocate for protecting basketry materials. Also, SIBA, I think, also talks about with protecting acorn gathering spots as well. But a lot of the tribes have forestry and natural resources department that'll do that. HSU is also, we'll celebrate HSU as a food cultural indigenous sovereignty food lab that's being opened up. They have funding. They're actually gonna have a groundbreaking. I think they had a groundbreaking last week. So there'll be some more discussions and workshops about that on the HSU campus where the BSS building is located. So yes. I think that's all I have. I was gabbing a lot. My coffee kicked in, but I just want to say thank you all. I'm honored to be a part of this, and just keep asking questions, keep talking to each other, keep creating a sense of community, and just give yourselves all a round of applause for all the work you did today, the audience out there, and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day 2021.
And so we just want to thank you for coming and sharing. It is not easy to share. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to open your heart and your soul up to a whole room and the internet too on top of it. So I just want to thank you. Thank you for your energy and coming on your day off to give to our campus and to our community. You're a gift to me. And for all of those present and those who are online, we have fry bread love here serving up Indian tacos. So please grab a ticket and come on out. And Vince, I want to make sure that you get that as well.
Okay.
I did not have time, but I have a formal present for you.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So here's the invisible present.
Okay, thank you.
It's in the mail.
She gave me a meal ticket literally for fry bread. So I have a meal ticket that has all kinds of terms. So yeah, I have a meal ticket. So my wife's out there. I have a meal ticket.
Awesome. So I just want to thank everyone for being present. Thank you for listening so intently. And thank you for sharing.
You're very welcome. Thank you, everybody.